Okay, so for today's video, I wanted to really get to the root of why I made this channel in the first place, and that is to help educate people, especially for those of you who are just getting started or are trying to learn more about what we do. And so I figured one of the best ways to do this would be to talk about some of the things that I consistently give notes on to people when they're just getting started. When I try out a new effects editor on maybe like a short film or some smaller project and they ask me for feedback, I'm going to go over the top 5 mistakes or things that I think could be improved by young editors, by people who are just getting started. What's up everybody? My name is Matt Yoakum and welcome to MYSOUND. Now, like I said in the intro, I'm going to be going over the top 5 mistakes that I see young editors make and how to think about correcting them so that when you are working for somebody new, you'll already have a leg up and hopefully avoid some of these pitfalls. Now, just to say, I was 100% in this exact same position at one point, right? Like, I had a start to my career, I made a bunch of these exact same mistakes because I feel like they're natural. Like this is just part of the learning process. But the goal of this channel here is to educate you and to help speed you along through some of these things. So I'm going to fast track you past some of the most basic mistakes that I see made by young editors frequently. So before we dive into it, if you haven't already, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button down there. It really helps me out, helps out the channel so that I can continue to bring new content to you guys just like this. So without further ado, let's get to it. Okay, number 1. One of the most common things that I get from brand new editors is overcut material. What do I mean by that? There's a door that shuts, there's a punch, there's a gunshot, whatever it is, and I've got like 8 or 10 or 12 layers for that simple thing. A common misconception amongst young editors, people who are just getting started, and this is myself included, is that more is more. If you're not sure how a creature should sound, or not sure how that gunshot should sound, or you're not sure how to make that punch more impactful, you think that maybe you just need more layers and you just add more and more to it. In sound design, more is not necessarily more. A lot of time, more equals mud. Think of the sounds that you're adding to your timeline sort of like mixing colors of paint. If you add blue and yellow together, you get green. But if you add green and yellow and blue and red together and you start adding in all these different colors and stacking them on top of each other, you just get brown or gray. And one of the easiest ways to help simplify and to reduce the amount of sounds that you're cutting is to start thinking of it the way musicians think of music. Start thinking in terms of frequency ranges. A good way to think about this, whether it's a door or a gunshot or a punch, is to think of it like a drum kit, because they are designed to cover the full spectrum of the frequency range. So you have your kick, which is mostly focused on the low end, you have your snare, which is mostly focused on the mid-range, and you have a cymbal or a hi-hat, which are mostly focused on the high end. Obviously, this is a simplification, but I think you get the idea. There's a golden rule to follow here. If you have 8 layers of something comprising a sound, and you can turn off one of those layers and not hear a difference, you don't need it. One of the important things to understand about this in sound is that the layers that you're putting on there, even if you can't hear them, is affecting the total amount of headroom that you're eating up. Energy in sound is cumulative. So even if you're not hearing that layer, you are eating up headroom. The energy is being added. On our full scale meter, we only have a certain amount of energy available before we hit 0 dBFS, and then we just go into clipping or distortion. And what happens is the more that you pile into there, a lot of times, especially in the digital domain, it just ends up sounding squashed and small, and you actually lose definition. So you can think of it this way, the less layers you use, actually the more impact you can get. There's a bunch of instances where you may get 8 layers of something and it sounds kind of squashed and uninteresting. You can mute like 4 of them and then turn some of those other layers down a little bit, and you actually get a more impactful sound because you're not squashing against the digital ceiling of 0 dBFS. So let me show you this quick example. Here's a super common way that I may see a punch delivered to me from a sound effects editor. okay, it doesn't sound terrible. It's a little mid-rangey. It could use a little more punch, a little more low end. Let's just go through these layers really fast here. And we're gonna keep in mind that drum set analogy where we're focusing on frequency ranges, and I'm just gonna kind of call out the frequency ranges I hear as we go. I'm gonna turn the zoom down here a bit. Mostly mid-range, mostly mid-range. That's got a little bit more thump, so that's a little bit more low end. More mid-range, a little bit more transient. More mid-range with a little bit more high-end information. It's got more high and a little bit of low. And mid-range. So when we play these all together, it sounds okay. Now let's mute, let's say, one of these layers. So I've got several mid-range things here. Let's mute one of them. Let's mute this guy. So here it is before and after. I don't know about you, but it sounds identical to me, meaning this layer is not helping us whatsoever. So we're going to turn it off. It's going to save us headroom. Now let's listen to the next layer. Let's listen to it all together. And gone. I'm going to mute that one. Now how about, I know this layer down here was basically just mid-range. Here it is all together. Let's mute that one. Okay, so it's giving it a bit of the lead in. So what I would do is mute that transient. The transient's not helping us, and just leave the whoosh in, which is fine. Okay, versus back on. Sounds the same without this transient. So again, we're saving even more headroom. We've already eliminated almost half of our layers here. Here they are all together. And without this, sounds the same. It's still lacking a little bit of low end. And this is one of those things where it's like we're missing an element that's got that rich, deep bass, that impact. And I'm down to 4 layers out of the 8, and we haven't even really heard a huge shift. So I'm just going to turn them all back on and play the before and after. Maybe we put this one back. What I would rather see delivered is something with fewer layers and more focus on the frequency ranges. An example like this. Okay, so maybe we're missing a little bit of the mid-range in there, but I could grab this sound, which had some nice mid-range in it. And this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers, but they're really specifically thought out. So here's this mid-range layer, which is nice. That's a lot of high end. This is kind of a sharper, short transient. This is a little more mid-low range. This is almost entirely bass. Those may have overlap, so let's try without that one. And then this one down here is a stereo sweetener. Now, I'll explain why I cut this in stereo in just a second. So that sounds pretty decent as far as a punch goes to me. I actually think it even sounds better with that layer in. I think it works. I may dip the transient of this one so that we're not increasing the total headroom that we're eating up right on the transient with the others, because I like the head and the tail of it. Yeah, it doesn't sound any different. What I could even do if I wanted to be extreme about it would just be like, do something like this. Now, I said I would explain this bottom element real quick, so I'll just do that. This element down here is a synthesized kick that I created, and you'll hear it's almost entirely low end. Now, why is it cut in stereo when everything else was cut in mono? This is a trick I do when I'm doing stylized sort of action punches or impacts, where when you cut the mono elements of a punch, it's like a singular point source thing, right? It's gonna be coming out of the center channel. So when I cut something in stereo, it's gonna go to the left and right speakers and not the center speaker, where I have much more headroom available, right? Like if I'm using 90% of the available energy in the center speaker for this punch with the mono elements, I have 100% free energy available to me in the left and right speakers. This is sort of a simplification, but I'm just trying to make the point. Low end frequency has a special characteristic where below a specific frequency range, I'd say maybe starting below around 200 hertz and lower from that, maybe even a bit lower, maybe 100 hertz and lower, we start to lose the perception of directionality. You can't really tell where it's coming from. The beauty of this is that I can put just low end in the left and right speakers and have the punch in the center. And because it's going to play a phantom stereo image for me anyways, it's going to sound like one cohesive element. Now, if I were to take higher frequencies and put them left and right, it's gonna sound like they're coming from the left and right speakers, which we don't want for something like a punch. But if you put just low end there, it's a really great way of adding extra low end support without messing up the imaging of where something sounds like it's coming from. So keep in mind, more is not always more. Think like a drum kit where you're thinking in terms of frequency ranges. And if you can mute an element without hearing a difference, get rid of it. Tip number 2, cutting everything in mono versus cutting things in stereo. This is a super common mistake that I see editors making, especially when they're working on stereo-only systems. Whether you're working in headphones or you just have a left and right speaker, if you're cutting for something that is ultimately going to be mixed in 5.1 or 7.1 or Atmos or whatever format beyond stereo, you need to keep this in mind. Part of the illusion or the trap that you fall into when you only have a left and right speaker but you're cutting for surround formats is that anything that you cut mono, you're always getting a phantom center, meaning your left and your right speaker are playing that sound at the exact same time, and it is giving you the illusion of something coming up the middle. So what happens there is you're cutting a lot of mono sounds and you think that you're fine because you're covered in your left and right. But what you need to understand is that when you go from a stereo system to a 5.1 or a 7.1 or an Atmos system, is that you will have a dedicated center channel. So let's say you want to cut an explosion. I'm just going to give a random example here. If you cut this only in mono, it is only going to come out of the center speaker. And if you imagine you're sitting in a movie theater and that screen is 35 or 40 or 50 feet across, and it's only coming from the middle, but the image that you're seeing is all the way from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, it's not going to have that larger than life cinematic quality. Whereas if I cut things in stereo, I can spread them across the left and right channels and it will sound much, much larger in a big theater. The other advantage to cutting things in stereo is that if I need it to be mono, if I need it to be just straight up the center, I can just fold it down, or I can drag those stereo tracks up to mono tracks and mute one side of it and pan that mono element of one leg of the stereo sound. There are so many instances where you don't want your effects just coming out of the center channel. So even when you're working at home and you're working on a 27 or a 32-inch screen in front of you, you have to imagine that it's going to play on a screen 30 feet across. So cut in stereo for anything that feels like it needs to have extra width available. So for something like a punch or a gunshot, you would probably normally cut those mostly in mono because that's a point source sound. So if somebody punches somebody on screen, you don't want that to sound like it's coming out of your left and right speakers in a big theater. You mostly want that to feel like it's coming from a singular place. But for something like a car engine or a huge creature roar or an explosion or a spaceship, whatever it may be, if it's going to take up most of your screen, you're going to want the ability to pan that wide and even pull it into the room. So keep that in mind if you're cutting, especially if you're cutting on headphones or on a stereo system, but it's going to go to a larger format in the end. Third mistake, cutting only noise-based elements versus tonal elements. What do I mean by this? Noise is when you have a lot of frequencies blended together to create noise. When you think of pink noise or white noise, those are all of the frequencies spread across a range and you're hearing them at the same time, hence noise. Some examples of some noisy things. A car crash is a noisy thing. Fire is a noisy thing. A gunshot is a noisy thing. But we can inject tonal elements, specific frequencies, more targeted musical sorts of sounds that help those noisy elements stick out in a mix. Why is this important? Just like I said, lots of frequencies combined equals noise, right? Well, when you're playing a mix, you've got all kinds of sounds happening at the same time. So if you've got music, dialogue, sound effects going all simultaneously, you're gonna have a noisy mix. And if you need something to cut through, let's say gunshots in an action sequence, you need some way for those to cut through other than just making them louder. An easy way to have your element cut through a noisy mix is to give it a specific tonal element that is easy to hear. We want contrast in tone here. I'm going to give you a brief example here, and you can tell me which one you think would be easier to hear in a really busy mix. Okay, I hope this one seems obvious. That second one is really going to stick out in a mix. It's sort of like if there's a sea of people wearing gray shirts and everybody's waving and you're trying to spot your friend. You want your friend to be wearing a yellow shirt. That's kind of a funny analogy, but that's kind of a good way to think about it when you're cutting sounds. You want something that is going to have contrast in the mix, and tonal elements really do that. Not to mention, they really add to the style of what you're cutting. My friend Mike Gallagher over at INDEPTH Sound did this really cool in-depth dive into the history of the classic pew 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 sound that goes into silencers. You should absolutely go and check out his channel. I'll leave a link down in the description. But what makes those sounds so great is that it's not just the clack clack of a gun, that's a realistic silencer, but they've added in these ricochet sounds, these pew pew sounds that really help them cut through a mix. So when it's a giant action sequence where there's cars and explosions and music and yelling and all kinds of stuff happening, those gunshots really stand out in the mix, especially because higher frequencies tend to stand out much easier in a mix than lower elements. So keep that in mind as you're cutting. Okay, fourth mistake. When editors cut only beds for backgrounds instead of using specifics. You'll hear just what a difference can be made in just over 5 seconds with these two different examples. This first example is a great example of how I would normally receive some backgrounds from a junior editor when I ask for wind, birds, and traffic. Here's how I would cut that same 5 seconds if I were doing it myself. Hopefully you can hear a huge difference between these two 5-second examples. In the first example, I did cut an element that had birds, I did cut an element that had traffic, and I did cut an element that had wind through trees. The difference is that all three of those beds had noise already in them, and they're just static files, so they sound like white noise. There's nothing dynamic or interesting about them, and if you are cutting traffic that sounds like noise, air and wind that sounds like noise, and recordings of birds that have noise in them, you wind up with noise. What I much prefer is for elements to be gliding in and out of each other to create a dynamic, rich, immersive environment, like in this second example. So I'm just going to quickly take you through these layers so that you can see what I'm talking about. These first two layers are air. They do have noise in them, but they've also got texture. When I'm listening to leaves through the trees, you can hear that in this lower example. And then that fades out and we fade into a more steady bed so that it's evolving over the course of 5 seconds. So here's those two elements. And there's some light bird chirps you can hear in that top one. Then, instead of just cutting general wash of traffic, I've got a specific car that's got a little bit of character in it. And I'm always trying to tell stories in my head whenever I'm cutting backgrounds. So for this example, I just literally pictured in my head, there's this sort of noisy, rattly car that drives by, and the neighborhood dog hears it and starts barking. Right? Now, normally I'd have reverb and stuff on that, but for this demonstration, just turning it down in volume is effective. Next, I've got a couple really specific birds that I've spaced out. Right? So all together, within 5 seconds, I have a lot of information about the environment that I'm in. There's birds, there's wind, there's a car going by, and there's a neighborhood dog that's barking. This is so much more powerful for conveying storytelling in your backgrounds than just cutting beds alone. Please be sure to cut specifics. One other quick note here, when you're cutting specifics, be listening to the dialogue guide track. Don't just turn off the dialogue guide and start cutting blindly through your scene and sort of randomly interspersing sounds. You can really use backgrounds to help tell stories, especially when you're placing them in between moments of silence and dialogue. For example, if two characters are having an argument back and forth and then they reach an impasse where there's this sort of long, awkward pause, that might be the perfect moment to have some distant event take place or not. If you're just randomly putting bird chirps and dog barks throughout your scene, and most of it is happening when dialogue is happening on screen, a lot of that's going to disappear. It's just going to be buried or muted to protect the intelligibility of the dialogue. But if we put them in the gaps in between, you can actually fill individual elements in between, and it has the knock-on effect of creating an environment that feels dynamic and immersive, and your ear doesn't get bored. When you play just noise, even for just 10 seconds, your brain does a really good job of filtering out information it doesn't feel it needs, and one of the ways it does that is when something remains static. So we maintain interest in our backgrounds by creating dynamic events and telling yourself little stories as you cut it. Fifth and final mistake: overdoing noise reduction on dialogue. This is something I was guilty of when I was just getting started. I just have to say this: noise is not always the enemy. Noise is only the enemy in your dialogue tracks when it's distracting or when it's competing with the intelligibility of what you're supposed to be hearing. The thing is, when you over noise reduce, it can actually become even more distracting than the noise was, and it can also eat into the intelligibility, especially when it starts to eat into those higher frequencies. I would much rather have a scene with noise that was really smooth and consistent with long fade-ins and fade-outs of fill than to hear dialogue that's cut really short where you hear that noise pop in and out, or when it's been overly noise reduced and it sounds pristine. One of the beauties of production dialogue that's captured on set is that it also inherently is capturing some of the organic sound and the organic noise that happens when humans are moving around. So some of that cloth rustle that you hear, some of the natural footsteps in production, some of the skin as people touch their faces or touch their body, all of that can make it into those recordings, and even though there's a layer of noise under it, it feels natural. It feels like the texture that was recorded on the day. All you have to do is picture recording ADR from one of those scenes where you replace all of that with a person who's standing in a studio instead of sitting in a restaurant or standing outside by the street. And you can just imagine how that silence in between and the perfection of that studio microphone would stand out in that environment. And you'll start to understand that some of that production texture is actually worth protecting. I mentioned it during mistake number 4. Your brain does a really good job of filtering away sort of static, non-changing things. It's the reason why you're not constantly thinking about the temperature of the room you're in as long as you're comfortable. It's always helpful to do a little less noise reduction than you may think you need and to actually preserve the integrity of that original recording. And that's it. There's obviously a lot more advice to be given when it comes to junior editors and growing more proficient in this craft, but these are some of the most common things and some of the most common feedback that I give when I'm receiving materials from somebody who's just getting started. If you happen to think that there's a common mistake that maybe I missed or something that you have a question about, ask it down in the comments or let me know what you think and we can discuss it down there. As always, I really hope that you found this information useful. Thank you so much for watching. Do me a huge favor, subscribe to the channel, like the video if you learned something, leave me a comment down below. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you around.